Welcome everyone to the second webinar in the coordination webinar series of 2016. This one is about first section of the coordination handbook, and it is focused on the framework for humanitarian coordination. My name's Natalie McCauley and I'm the global focal point for learning and development, and the other presenter is Sarah Lim, who's our global help desk technical support. So by the end of this webinar, we're going to hopefully examine the type of analysis required of national coordination structures. We're going to review international humanitarian coordination architecture, and we're going to look at working with the protection cluster and some top tips for that. And we will also reflect on coordination in mixed situations. Again, this is all based on the structure within the coordination handbook and the section 1 of the coordination handbook, which has 6 components to it. The first component is the types of humanitarian coordination. The second is national humanitarian coordination. The third is international humanitarian coordination architecture. The fourth is coordination of protection and child protection in cluster approach. The fifth is the humanitarian program cycle, and the sixth is coordination in mixed settings. Just before I go into the first component, I just wanted to make sure that if you do have any questions throughout, please don't hesitate to ask. We have a chat box, which is probably more effective than the question box, is what we've found. So on the right-hand panel that you have, it could actually be on the left-hand side of your screen, I've been told, but down the bottom is chat, and that's where you can actually ask questions and everyone can see your questions. So feel free to answer. We may have to leave them till the end, but we'll do our best to answer them for you. So this first component is about the types of humanitarian coordination. Within the handbook, you will see a chart that is exactly the same as what is on the screen. And basically, it challenges you to ask questions of yourselves in the field before you decide what type of coordination structure should be in place or is in place in your location. The shape of a humanitarian coordination varies in different emergencies and contexts. So many of you have been in multiple emergencies and you would understand the differences based on that context. The type of coordination structure that is appropriate depends very much on the size of the emergency and its impact. The strength of the government is very critical, and whether they can address the needs towards that affected population. So some of the questions are, is it a natural disaster or a complex emergency? Is it an emergency that's a sudden onset or protracted? Are the affected populations IDPs or refugees? What is the estimated size of the affected population? Is the national government the national government has the mandate to coordinate and ensure the response, but does it have adequate capacity? Where the government has the capacity to coordinate the response to an emergency, it will do so based on established national systems and structures. Now, in part 2 of the coordination handbook, this is also included, so please explore that. You'll see throughout this process that coordination handbook is very much interwoven and interlinked. So if you have a part of the handbook that you go into and you need further information, it usually will refer you on to another part that will go further in depth. Now, international partners can reinforce the government's coordination capacity if requested, and where the government does not have the capacity to coordinate the response to an emergency, the international community will usually be requested to support the relief effort. For these contexts, the UN and the IASC have outlined the recommended methods of coordination. It should be noted at this point that if it is a response involving refugee populations, UNHCR has the mandate to respond and will do so using a refugee coordination model. Now, we will talk further about this later on in the presentation. The second component of this first section is around national humanitarian coordination. This quote is used in the handbook, and it's quite an interesting quote. It comes actually from an evaluation that was conducted in 2010 on humanitarian responses, and it found that in their current implementation, clusters largely exclude national and local actors. And I think many of our own research within our AOR has found this as too, and it particularly has found that it's failed to link with and build on or support existing coordination and response mechanisms. Among other reasons, this is due to insufficient analysis of local structures and capacities before cluster implementation. So this is where the emphasis on preparedness also comes in the new humanitarian program cycle. Each state has the responsibility first and foremost to take care of its populations affected by disasters and other emergencies. The affected state has the primary role in the initiation, organisation, coordination and implementation of humanitarian assistance within its territory. Ensuring a better analysis of national coordination structures is vital to improving our collective humanitarian responses. A national response involves a large number of government departments or agencies, including those responsible for health and social welfare. This is why in many countries a body has been established within the government whose role it is to coordinate this range of departments. This body has different names, and in the handbook we're actually referring to the National Disaster Management Agency or a National Civil Protection Agency, but it's actually referred to as NDMA in the handbook. But you would have to obviously convert that into what is appropriate in your location. Be interesting to know too, and to engage on what can you do in your situation to map these systems. And has this already been done? Was this done before your emergencies? And don't forget to use the chat box below. In terms of just general structure, we do have an outline in our handbook. There's also an outline in the IASC module, which is in our handouts as well. In terms of the ideas around structures within governments, there are three main models. And basically the NDMA can sit within the Prime Minister's office, which is a model that's used in Colombia and Uganda, or it can form a disaster management unit, which is in line with a local government ministry. This is like Bangladesh or Zimbabwe. And the third model is that there's no single NDMA, but instead line ministries have the use. And this is like in Turkey. The role of NDMA is to develop government policies, plans and guidelines for disaster management, carry out emergency preparedness measures, including contingency planning, and in the event of national level emergencies to coordinate the response. You can also find out more about your country, where you are or where you may be deployed next. On Relief Web, they actually have a tab on topics, and they have a lot of the structures outlined there. So it's a very useful internet site. Any comments or questions so far? I think we're okay so far. Any hands up? All good? Keep plowing through. So section 3 in this component is international coordination structure. And I guess this is where a lot of people can get confused depending on the settings. But let's just give you some background to it. It is mostly based on the United Nations General Assembly resolution, and you know, it does have quite a long history. I mean, this was in 1991, so it's quite a significant amount of time, and I guess sort of emphasizes why we've had a number of different revisions of it and additions to it, and certainly the Transformative Agenda in the last sort of 5 years, 5 to 10 years, I should say. But basically the resolution laid down a number of cornerstones and particularly that includes the Emergency Relief Coordinator, the Consolidated Appeals Process, which has now been replaced by the Humanitarian Program Cycle, the Central Emergency Revolving Fund, which in 2005 became SURF, and the role of the Department of Humanitarian Affairs, which in 1998 transformed into OCHA. And so I think there has been a lot of transformations and a lot of changes, but it's basically grown and it's adapted because the emergencies have got bigger and more regular. You can find more information on this on un.org. Now the picture's a bit blurry, but basically the IASC, which is an acronym that you'll hear all the time, but it does stand for the Interagency Standing Committee, has full members and standing invitees. And many have a similar sort of, even though they're standing invitees, they're not considered that way in the conversation. It was established in 1992, so it also has a very long history. And again, it was established in response to the resolution we were just talking about on strengthening humanitarian assistance. It is the primary mechanism for interagency coordination of humanitarian assistance. Under the leadership of the Emergency Relief Coordinator, IASC develops humanitarian policies, agrees on a clear division of responsibility for various aspects of humanitarian assistance, identifies and addresses gaps in response, and advocates for effective application of humanitarian principles. It is the only decision-making group that includes UN agencies, the World Bank, IOM, and humanitarian organisations. In terms of structure, IASC consists of principals, working groups, and subsidiary bodies. The IASC principals are the leads of all IASC member organisations or their representatives, while the working groups bring together the emergency directors or the directors from IASC members. The member organisations of IASC include UNICEF, UNDP, UNHCR, UNFPA, WFP, FAO, WHO, UN Habitat and OCHA. And then you have the standing invitation, which is IOM, ICRC, IFRC, OHCHR, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, and the World Bank. There's also the NGO consortium of ICVA and the Interaction Steering Committee. And the Steering Committee for Humanitarian Response are invited on a permanent basis. And you'll find that all of these groups are very much involved, which is why it takes a long time for things to get through and pass, particularly things like massive changes, including the Transformative Agenda. So Transformative Agenda really is the most latter stage. It sort of started in 2005, and it has three main pillars: more adequate, flexible and timely humanitarian financing, strengthening strategic leadership through humanitarian coordinators, and improving coordination of sectorial responses through the cluster approach. There is a fourth cross-cutting element that was about establishing stronger humanitarian partnerships among and between humanitarian actors, using the principles of partnership. Then we have a big part of this humanitarian reform, which is the cluster approach. And it was all about reforming the process to improve the effectiveness of humanitarian response through greater predictability, accountability, responsibility, and partnership. And obviously this is the most visible form, and it's what we have to engage in on a daily basis. Clusters are groups of humanitarian organisations, United Nations and outside groups, working in the main sectors of humanitarian action. They are created when clear humanitarian needs exist within a sector, when there are numerous actors within a sector, and when national authorities need support. There are currently 11 clusters. You can see that on the graph here. And there are a number of AORs under the protection cluster, which we'll talk about in a minute. Clusters provide a clear point of contact and are accountable for ensuring adequate and appropriate humanitarian assistance. Clusters create partnership among international humanitarian actors, national and local authorities, and civil society. The cluster approach was applied for the first time during the response to the Pakistan earthquake in 2005, but it's been used since then in well over 30 humanitarian emergencies. So which actors are responsible for what under the cluster approach? Well, we have the Emergency Relief Coordinator, who's under the Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and who leads the IASC and is responsible for the oversight of all emergencies. We have a Humanitarian Coordinator who's accountable to the ERC and is responsible for assessing whether or not an international response is warranted and whether we need to ensure humanitarian efforts are organised. And then we have the Humanitarian Country Team, which is a strategic and operational decision-making and oversight forum, which is established by the HC. It's made up of representatives from the UN, IOM, INGOs, Red Cross, Red Crescent, and agencies that are also designated cluster leads and need to represent their clusters plus their organisations. There's also a number of areas that we need to consider, that the government retains the primary role in the initiation, organisation and coordination and implementation of humanitarian assistance. That cluster lead agencies manage any given cluster at a country level and heads the cluster lead agencies are accountable to the humanitarian coordinator. Cluster coordinators are responsible for ensuring the cluster-specific concerns and challenges that cannot be solved within the cluster are raised and discussed with the HCT. They ensure, for example, that strategic decisions are shared and acted upon at the operational level. Cluster activation is based on an analysis of humanitarian need, existing coordination mechanisms, and capacity on the ground. We must remember that IASC principles have agreed that activation of clusters should be strategic, deliberate, and time-limited. The aim of a cluster activation is to strengthen rather than replace a government sectorial coordination. Now let's look at some of the useful distinctions, I think, that we often get in training. The difference between a HC and an RC. The HC supports coordination of humanitarian operations among international actors, UN and non-UN. The RC supports coordination of development operations among UN actors only. HC versus UNCT. Whereas the UNCT includes the heads of all agencies plus IOM, the HCT comprises only heads of the UN's humanitarian agencies as well as non-UN humanitarian agencies. The UNCT focuses on the UN's support for national development programs, while the HCT addresses strategic issues of the wider humanitarian community. It needs to be noted that like the HC and RC functions, the UNCT and HCT coexist. They do not replace each other. The RC or HC is responsible for ensuring complementarity, and that's a great word, between the two entities. HCT versus clusters. The HCT provides strategic and policy guidance to the overall response effort, whereas country-level clusters implement the strategy by coordinating operational response efforts in their respective areas of expertise. Country cluster lead agencies are members of the HCT. Let us know if you have any questions on that, because that's one of the ones that we quite often get questions on when we're in face-to-face training. Now, there are some criteria for cluster activation. The first one being response and coordination gaps that exist. So obviously due to a sharp deterioration or a significant change. And the second one is existing national response or coordination capacity is unable to meet the needs in a manner that respects humanitarian principles. So that's when the scale of the need, the number of actors, there's a need for a multi-sectorial approach, or there's other constraints in the ability to respond. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah now to talk about section 4, which is around the coordination of protection and child protection in the cluster approach.
I wanted to also refer to the question and answer document that's one of the handouts. It's the second one. It says English Q&A. And basically, within that handout, you're able to find the most common questions that are asked regarding how does the child protection subcluster work with the protection cluster. So if you want to click on that second handout and start downloading it, then I think we can look at it a little bit later. But basically, within the handbook, the definition of protection is offered as defined by the IASC. And basically, protection is defined as all activities aimed at ensuring full respect for the rights of the individual in accordance with the letter and spirit of the relevant bodies of law. For example, the human rights law, international humanitarian law, and refugee law. As this is quite broad, basically in 2005, the IASC agreed that the work of the protection cluster would be subdivided. And one of the areas of responsibility is child protection, where we fall. But the other ones include, for example, GVP, that's led by UNFPA and UNICEF, Mine Action, that's led by UNMAS, and Housing, Land, and Property, which is led by NRC, co-facilitated by IFRC. So basically, even though it is a subcluster or area responsibility, the responsibility of the cluster lead agency is the same as, for example, the protection cluster. Now, experience has shown that it is helpful to look at what are the differences between child protection vis-a-vis protection. And basically, within the handbook, there is a very nice chart where they look at the differences in terms of the origins, the rights focus, the professional profile, the core elements of analysis, the strategic focus, and the core skills and knowledge that are required to work in child protection versus protection. And it is recommended for subcluster coordinators and cluster coordinators to be knowledgeable about not only the roots and the framework of the protection cluster, but also the subclusters that are within, housed within the protection cluster. So this process was established in 2005 as part of the humanitarian reform process. And UNHCR is the cluster lead agency for the Global Protection Cluster. It's also often referred to as a GPC. And then the cluster lead agency for child protection is UNICEF. So the GPC, they coordinate and provide global level policy, support, guidance in terms of the implementation of the cluster approach for protection clusters in the field. And this is specifically to non-refugee settings. UNHCR, they provide leadership in largely conflict-induced IDP context, and where it is where the humanitarian action is induced by disasters, then at the country level there is a consultation that occurs between UNHCR, UNICEF, and if they are present, OHCHR, in terms of who will lead. So, for example, there are contexts like Fiji or, let's say, Nepal. In Nepal, where UNICEF is the lead for the protection cluster there. So, in brief, that is the presentation in terms of the responsibilities of the protection cluster vis-a-vis the child subcluster, or at the global level we refer to it the AOR, or the area of responsibility. If you now have the Q&A, that was one of the handouts. I just wanted to, in addition to what is in the handbook, wanted to refer to you to this additional resource that we have, where common questions in terms of how we need to work better with the protection cluster is laid out in this document. So some key questions beyond the principles and responsibilities that tie us together. They also look at, in terms of the accountability and responsibilities, they look at the functions and responsibilities of the subcluster vis-a-vis the protection cluster. And then I think this relationship has even become that much more important with the humanitarian program cycle, where often within the humanitarian needs overview, there is one protection strategy that is presented, so that the child protection subcluster coordinators and the subcluster itself needs to work that much more closely with the protection cluster. At the end of the document, there is some common tips that have been compiled based on the advice that was provided by active coordinators. And some of the tips, I think, they're very practical in terms of, for example, having the subclusters as a standing item on the protection cluster's meeting agenda, to ensure that as a subcluster coordinator that you are participating, for example, in the protection cluster meetings and vice versa, to see if that they could even be scheduled together so that the subcluster meetings occur before the protection cluster meetings, so that they could, the results of the meeting could be presented and discussed within the protection cluster meeting. At the same time, it is recommended that governance arrangements are kept lean and agile, and that for the most part don't seek too much of a hierarchical or bureaucratic approach to the cluster coordination, and that that's the strong soft skills, team spirit, and humor in coordination guarantees a better level of coordination. So I think that this Q&A is one document that I would highly recommend. Natalie, if I pass it back to you to look at the HPC.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And exactly, I think if everyone can really have a look at that document, let us know if you find it useful too. And if you have any top tips, please send them our way, because we always like to collect those things. It's very useful for us as well to keep developing these documents. So the section 5 of this part of the handbook does deal with the humanitarian program cycle. The humanitarian program cycle was developed by the IASC as a guide to respond to all types of crises. The original one, if you actually look in the middle of this, it was much smaller, and now in the most recent IASC coordination reference module, which is also in the handouts, they have expanded it so that it includes protracted emergencies as well as quick onset, and also does talk to the HRP, or the Humanitarian Response Plan, including evaluations, and it has the days and everything, as you can see. But we're going to focus in on the middle. In a later webinar, we will look more closely at that sort of strategic planning. But it does provide a way for us to sort of look at the situation. So this is the more in-depth component of it. What you can see there is that there are 6 key elements in the cycle. We've got emergency response preparedness, which is around the outside. the needs assessment and analysis, which is the first component on the arrow here. And then you've got the strategic response planning, which is now also the humanitarian response planning. We've got resource mobilisation, implementation and monitoring, and then you go around to your peer review, your operational and peer review. The overriding and two enablers is coordination and information management, and you can see that the affected populations are at the heart of this humanitarian program cycle now. It recognises that the primary responsibility for assisting and protecting people affected by emergencies lies with the state, and the international humanitarian community must engage with and complement the state's role where assistance is requested. The HPC is intended to guide this engagement by creating a process that defines complementary roles and responsibility. What it does is it creates predictability. It enables us to define steps that replace the consolidated appeals process and consists of a set of interlinked tools to assist the HC and the HCT in the delivering of humanitarian assistance. What they found when they did the evaluations leading up to the Transformative Agenda is that we weren't consistent. Every emergency was completely different, and this was like we were starting at square one at each emergency. Now we have a clear path in each emergency, and many of you dealing with emergencies right now may say that it's not perfect. We know that it's not perfect, but at least we know what to expect. We know that we actually have to do a needs analysis. We know that we need to do a humanitarian response plan. We know we need to contribute to that and work with the protection cluster to do that. You can see that by day 14, a mirror report needs to have been done. We know that by day 30, the HRP needs to be done. We know that by, another 30 days, we need to have done some sort of appeals process. We know by day 90 that there should have been some sort of evaluation. And this process is ongoing. It never stops. It is designed around a learning cycle, and I think that's important to remember. And the idea would be that in the field we are meant to be learning from our processes and from each emergency and applying that learning the next time the cycle goes on. But I think it's important to remember that not one size fits all. So even though this is a very predictable system, we now know what to expect. The application can be done slightly differently, and tools should be applied in a flexible manner depending on where you are and what is prioritised and how you work with the government and other clusters. But basically we should have some sort of predictability and standards when it relates to delivery. It's important to note that this graphic is quite overwhelming and can be difficult to use in the field, but I think it's actually worth printing it off as a large base, not in a sort of small slide, and going through this with partners so partners can actually understand what the deadlines are, what is going to be needed, when it's going to be needed, and why you might be asking for certain things at different times. It really visualises the key elements of the HPC, and it really looks at the two rings, not necessarily seeing it as all separate. So before you would maybe have a timeline that was from left to right. On the days it never related to the actual program cycle itself, and now it's all interrelated. The outer ring depicts the more operational sort of side of things, and the inner ring talks more about the learning cycle and how we actually work. Again, please let us know if you have any questions and any comments. Sarah, did you want to add to that?
No. I saw that you had moved on in terms of the coordination context.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, but definitely do let us know if, I'm wondering at the end if you could also just open up the mics.
Yeah.
So that we can chat more freely.
For sure.
So in section 1, in the sixth chapter, they look at the mandates and responsibility of the United Nations agencies. But I thought we would specifically focus on the advice or guidance that's provided related to mixed coordination context, because in the last retreat for child protection coordinators, this was raised as one of the critical issues that people were struggling with. And basically, in terms of the guidance provided by the handbook, they define the mixed situations, including contexts that have basically a refugee response as well as a cluster system. We know that where there is a refugee operation, it is UNHCR who needs to take the lead, and the refugee coordination model is the one that will operate there. But I think the confusion may arise when you have refugees and IDPs in the same location. And then how does the different coordination models work together? So there is a document called a joint UNHCR/OCHA note on mixed situations. And basically the subtitle is Coordination Practice and the UNHCR Refugee Coordination Model that we would recommend that you look at in more detail. I think the key is that if there is the presence of IDPs and refugees within a context, and there are competing or two coordination models at play, the key task is really to harmonize their approach and to ensure that there isn't duplication. And that the other key that's recommended is that the coordination model that's used should be flexible and adaptable. So in the beginning, it may be that one agency is taking the lead, but that as the situation changes, as the response changes, it may be that there may be a transfer responsibility, not in terms of anybody's mandate, but in terms of who would provide the administrative support for coordination functions. So for sure, whenever there is a refugee response in place, UNHCR will maintain their coordination oversight structure. But there is if you go to the next slide, there is a role in terms of how the two coordination models can work well together to provide services and programs to children. So that could be either directly in terms of having some sort of agreement with one another. At the global level, there is a LOU, but it is possible to also look at developing an MOU at the local level. And the other model that we've seen in different contexts is that the joint program is provided by selecting the same implementing partner. So that coordination is needed between, for example, the two lead coordination agencies, UNICEF and UNHCR. Other points where collaboration can occur between the two coordination models is looking at assessments and conducting situation analysis. Also when strategic planning is conducted, advocacy, when technical support is provided, capacity building initiatives, and also in terms of looking at providing human and human material resources for the response. There is plenty of opportunity for collaboration within all these stages of the response process. So that's in brief what I wanted to share with you in terms of how it is possible to work within a mixed context, but I'm sure if you had specific questions, we could go into more detail and the advice would be more practical.
Thanks for your time, everyone, and we really appreciate that you all coming on for the webinar, and for those listening on the recording, we hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. If you have any follow-up questions afterwards, feel free to email me at nmacaulay@unicef.org or Natalie_Macaulay@hotmail.com.